The Persian Gulf, 1:33 a.m. Wednesday. The storm had been building for 6 days. A Shamal wind system originating in the Syrian desert had pushed a wall of fine particulate dust south across Iraq and into the Persian Gulf basin, reducing surface visibility to under 400 meters across a 900-kilometer stretch of the northern Gulf. The dust column extended to 14,000 feet. Optical sensors were blind. Commercial satellite passes over the region in the past 31 hours had returned nothing usable. The U.S. National Reconnaissance Office had flagged the coverage gap in its morning assessment. The assessment had been classified. It had been read by the right people on the right day. IRGC Aerospace Force planners had been watching the same Shamal system develop from the same meteorological feeds. What they saw was not a weather event. It was a window. The storm's peak coverage was forecast to last 72 hours. The gaps in optical satellite coverage were quantifiable. The degradation of ground-based radar systems operating in heavy particulate environments was documented in open-source literature that IRGC technical staff had studied for 4 years. What the dust degraded, what it did not, and what could be timed to exploit the difference. This had been the subject of a red cell planning exercise, codenamed Kavir, that had run for 18 months and produced a targeting architecture the IRGC believed was the most geometrically complete strike package it had ever assembled. Operation Kavir called for simultaneous launch from 3 independent geographic corridors, timed to produce terminal phase arrivals at the 3 target complexes within a 90-second window of each other. Corridor Alpha, Zagros mountain positions in Kermanshah province, 53 Shahab-3 and Emad ballistic missiles. Corridor Bravo, coastal positions in Bushehr and Fars provinces, 81 Fateh, 313, solid fuel ballistic missiles, and 42 Hoveyzeh, ground-launched cruise missiles. Corridor Charlie, the Strait of Hormuz and Eastern Gulf coastline, 67 Noor and Sadr anti-ship missiles launched from hardened coastal battery positions, and 4 IRGC fast patrol vessel groups operating under the assumption that the storm would prevent visual detection. 312 weapons. 3 targets. Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar. The carrier strike group operating 60 miles northeast of Bahrain. And, in the element that distinguished Kavir from every previous Iranian operational plan, Al Dhafra Air Base in the United Arab Emirates, specifically targeting the hangar complex housing the U.S.'s F-35C presence in the region. The 3-target architecture was not coincidence. It was geometry. IRGC planners calculated that defending 3 geographically separated targets simultaneously would force the U.S. defensive network to distribute its interceptor magazine across 3 envelopes rather than concentrating it on a single threat axis. Iranian planners had studied published U.S. interceptor loadouts, Aegis VLS magazine capacities, and THAAD battery ready loads. Their numbers were not far from correct. What their numbers did not account for was the depth of the system beyond the cataloged inventory, the pre-positioned reload capability, the speed of retasking, and the fact that the cooperative engagement capability could coordinate cross-theater interceptor allocation faster than human planners had modeled. The dust storm degraded optical sensors. It did not degrade the space-based infrared system. SBIRS operated at wavelengths that particulate matter in the lower atmosphere does not affect. 312 rocket motors igniting within a 44-second launch window generated a thermal signature visible from geosynchronous orbit through any weather system that does not physically block infrared radiation. Dust does not block infrared radiation. The SBIRS operator at Buckley Space Force Base was 29 years old. At 1:33 a.m. Mountain Time, his display registered 53 simultaneous thermal ignitions in the Zagros range. Corridor Alpha firing its full salvo. 7 seconds later, 81 additional ignitions along the Bushehr and Fars coastline. 11 seconds after the first cluster, 42 more as the Hoveyzeh batteries launched. He had never processed a launch event of this scale. He initiated the alert at 1:33 a.m., 14 seconds after first ignition. The system record was 9. He had processed 176 simultaneous tracks before pressing confirm. 9 seconds would not have been possible for this event. 14 was the fastest it could have been done. The corridor. Charlie launches 67 Noor and Qadr anti-ship missiles from coastal positions and IRGC fast patrol vessel groups began at 1:34 a.m. and were detected immediately. 31 seconds after the first launch, 312 tracks had been registered across 4 geographic clusters. By 1:34 a.m., the alert had reached CENTCOM, the Combined Air Operations Center at Al Udeid, and the carrier flag bridge simultaneously. The cooperative engagement capability began distributing targeting data across every Aegis-capable vessel in the Gulf. The THAAD battery at Al Udeid transitioned to full engagement mode. The THAAD battery at Al Dhafra, positioned 6 months earlier specifically in response to an intelligence assessment identifying Al Dhafra as an increasingly likely target, was also in full engagement mode. 2 THAAD batteries. 2 defended targets. The carrier strike group would rely on Aegis SM-3 and SM-6, CRAM, and carrier air wing intercept. The pre-authorized response protocol transmitted at 1:34 a.m. The authorization had been embedded in the protocol the moment the launch event exceeded threshold. 200 simultaneous detections, triggering automatic initiation without requiring human decision at the CENTCOM level. The system did not wait for it. At 1:36 a.m., 3 minutes after the Zagros launches, the first SM-3 Block 2A intercepts began. The Shahab-3 ballistic missiles from Corridor Alpha were at 190 kilometers altitude, approaching their apogees, descending on trajectories toward Al Udeid and Al Dhafra. 16 SM-3s launched from the Aegis cruiser and 2 destroyers of the carrier escort screen in the first salvo. 7 additional SM-3s launched from a second Aegis destroyer 15 seconds later. 23 SM-3 Block 2 as airborne simultaneously at $27.1 million per interceptor. $623.3 million of ordnance airborne in the first engagement salvo. Iran's Shahab-3 and Emad inventory, 53 missiles at an average $5 million each, represented $265 million of adversary investment. The U.S. launched $623 million in interceptors to neutralize $265 million in adversary missiles before a single weapon had been engaged. These numbers describe what defending military infrastructure against ballistic missile saturation costs. The alternative cost is never calculated by those who build the missiles. 18 of the 23 SM-3 intercepts achieved terminal phase engagement. 15 achieved confirmed neutralization. 3 failed guidance lock. 2 against maneuvering Emad re-entry vehicles. 1 due to a seeker head malfunction logged for investigation. 8 Shahab-3 and Emad warheads survived the SM-3 layer. 5 entered the THAAD envelope at Al Udeid. 3 entered the THAAD envelope at Al Dhafra. The Al Udeid THAAD battery engaged its 5 incoming threats at 1:38 a.m. 4 were intercepted within the nominal engagement envelope. The 5th, a Shahab-3 on a slightly compressed trajectory that entered the engagement envelope at the lower edge of THAAD's optimal intercept altitude, required a second interceptor after the first achieved partial proximity without confirmed neutralization. Both interceptors were launched within a 3-second window. The partial intercept fragmented the warhead. The second interceptor neutralized the primary fragment cluster at 1:38 a.m. Debris from the fragmentation continued on a ballistic path and was engaged by PAC-3 MSE at 1:39 a.m. One small fragment, 8 centimeters, impacted the outer perimeter wire of Al Udeid's northern boundary. No personnel were in that sector. No damage to structures. The Al Dhafra THAAD battery engaged its 3 incoming threats at 1:38 a.m. 2 were intercepted cleanly. The third tracked at an anomalous velocity profile, lower than expected for its launch weight, that fire control flagged as a potentially modified Emad variant. 2 interceptors launched simultaneously. Both achieved intercept at 31 kilometers altitude. The battery commander logged the velocity anomaly for intelligence reporting. The Fateh 313 engagement at both Al Udeid and Al Dhafra was running simultaneously. 81 solid fuel missiles from Corridor Bravo distributed across both target approaches. PAC-3 MSE batteries at both bases were the primary terminal defense layer. The critical constraint was not engagement capability. It was time compression. Fateh 313S from Bushehr province had an 8-minute 40-second flight time to Al Udeid. 8 minutes and 40 seconds from launch to terminal phase. PAC-3 MSE engagement began at 1:42 a.m. at Al Udeid and 1:41 a.m. at Al Dhafra. The PAC-3 engagement at Al Udeid was the most demanding defensive sequence of the operation. 43 Fateh 313s arriving in 5 sequential groups. Cluster design identical to documented IRGC saturation doctrine. The Northern Battery engaged its first 9 missile group at 1:42 a.m. All 9 intercepted. The second group arrived mid-reload. 7 missiles load-shifted to the eastern and western batteries. 5 intercepted. 2 reached close terminal phase. PAC-3 engaged both at 6 and 4 kilometers altitude. 1 warhead detonated 3.2 kilometers from the perimeter, too distant for structural damage. 1 impacted the southwestern vehicle staging area, generating a 14-meter crater. No personnel were present. The base dispersal protocol had cleared non-essential personnel to hardened positions at 1:34 a.m. when the launch alert was received. 2 Fateh 313 missiles impacted within Al Udeid's perimeter over the course of the full engagement. 3 impacted within Al Dhafra's perimeter. All 5 impacts were in unoccupied or non-critical areas, a consequence of the dispersal protocol that had moved personnel to hardened positions and cleared non-essential areas in the 9 minutes between alert and first terminal phase arrival. The runway at Al Udeid received 1 fragment strike on the approach end of the secondary runway. The primary runway remained fully operational throughout. Al Dhafra's flight operations continued without interruption. The Corridor, Charlie anti-ship and cruise missile engagement was the most complex and the most distributed. 67 Noor and Qadr anti-ship missiles and 42 Hoveyzeh cruise missiles, 109 weapons on sea skimming and terrain-following profiles. The dust storm had not degraded the E-3 Sentry AWACS. Operating at 30,000 feet above the dust column, its downward-looking radar tracked every sea-skimming missile against the surface clutter. The storm's visibility reduction, which IRGC planners expected to prevent visual identification of fast patrol vessel groups, had been irrelevant. Radar and thermal signature identification required no visibility. The IRGC fast patrol vessel groups had been tracked from the moment they departed their port approaches at 11:47 p.m., 98 minutes before they launched. F/A-18E/F. Super Hornets had been on elevated combat air patrol since 12:45 a.m., initiated after the Intelligence Watch Officer noted IRGC fast patrol vessel movements and flagged them as potentially pre-launch positioning. When the launch alert reached the carrier at 1:34 a.m., 8 F/A-18E/F aircraft were already at altitude, with full AIM-120D loadouts, positioned to intercept incoming cruise and anti-ship tracks. The carrier flight deck had been at surge operations tempo since 1:34 a.m. Under red lighting, in 28-degree Gulf air thickened by Shamal dust that had penetrated the ship's ventilation filters, aircraft were cycling at 60-second intervals, catapults firing, ordnance crews moving in the controlled urgency of a system rehearsed 340 times in the preceding 12 months. By 1:45 a.m., 14 aircraft were airborne in the intercept role. SM-6 intercepts of the anti-ship missile threat began at 1:37 a.m. The Aegis escort screen engaged Noor and Kavir missiles at ranges between 28 and 44 kilometers from the carrier. 41 SM-6 launches in the first 12 minutes. 37 achieved intercept. 4 Noor missiles survived to close range. CRAM engaged 3 at 5 to 8 kilometers. 1 Noor missile reached the CYWS engagement zone at 1:49 a.m. at 1.2 kilometers range. The missile was neutralized at 0.8 kilometers. Fragments impacted the carrier's port bow section. 3 flight deck personnel sustained injuries, 1 laceration requiring sutures, 2 minor contusions. All 3 were treated in the carrier's medical facility. 1 returned to flight deck duty within 2 hours, 2 placed on light duty. The carrier's flight operations did not stop. The injuries occurred during the post-detonation debris assessment, when personnel returned to stations before the all-clear had been fully processed. Noted in the post-engagement safety review. The Hoveyzeh cruise missile engagement was handled primarily by the carrier Air-Wing Intercept aircraft and PAC-3 MSE at the terminal phase over Udeid and Al Dhafra. 38 of 42 Hoveyzeh missiles were intercepted by F/A, 18 E/F aircraft between 1:38 a.m. and 1:54 a.m. 4 reached terminal defense zones at the 2 air bases and were neutralized by PAC-3 MSE at ranges between 9 and 14 kilometers from base perimeters. By 1:56 a.m., 23 minutes after the first Zagros launches, the adversary's 312 weapon salvo had been effectively addressed. Of 312 weapons launched, 299 had been intercepted across multiple layers. 13 had achieved some form of effect. 5 Fateh, 313 impacts at Al Udeid and Al Dhafra, 1 Noor carrier fragment impact, 3 Hoveyzeh impacts near base perimeters, 4 additional fragment or debris impacts from partial intercepts. U.S. personnel injured, 3, all minor. U.S. installations rendered non-operational, 0. Primary runways at both air bases remained operational throughout. The carrier strike group remained at full combat tempo. In the CENTCOM Command Center, counter-operation planning that had been running since 1:34 a.m. received full operational authority at 1:57 a.m. The designation, Granite Reach. Pre-planned, 16 months in development. 224 aim points across 147 Iranian military installations, covering all 3 launch corridors and the supporting infrastructure of each. 6 B-1B Lancer bombers, 4 from Al Udeid and 2 from Diego Garcia that had been repositioned 48 hours earlier in response to the intelligence assessment identifying elevated IRGC launch preparation activity, were airborne and had been receiving updated strike coordinates since 1:34 a.m. At 1:57 a.m., all 6 received final strike packages. Combined JASSM-ER payload, 144 missiles. At one point, $36 million per missile. $195.8 million of air-launched cruise ordnance entering Iranian airspace within 18 minutes. By minute 25 from first launch, U.S. munitions expenditure had reached $623.3 million in SEM-3 interceptors, $394 million in SM-6, PAC-3 MSE, and CRAM defensive ordnance, and was adding $195.8 million in JASSMER offensive ordnance. Running total, $1.213 billion. Still climbing. 2 B-2 Spirit bombers that had been operating on extended patrol from Diego Garcia received updated Granite Reach tasking at 2:04 a.m. Their assigned targets, the Shahab-3 production complex at Shahid Bagheri Industrial Group, designated for GBU 31 JDAM cluster engagement of surface facilities, and the IRGC Aerospace Force Kavir Operation Planning Center, a hardened command facility 40 meters underground in the Alborz Range. designated for 2 GBU-57 massive ordnance penetrators. EA-18G Growler electronic attack aircraft reached their jamming orbits at 2:01 a.m. The dust storm had already reduced optically guided Iranian air defense effectiveness to near zero. Growler jamming extended that degradation to the electromagnetic domain. S-300 PMU-2 batteries at Bushehr and Bandar Abbas found their engagement solutions corrupting within 4 minutes. Bavar 373 SAM systems in the Zagros region began experiencing command link degradation at 2:03 a.m. U.S. Cybercom had been executing pre-positioned network intrusion sequences against Iranian integrated air defense software since 1:41 a.m., operating under pre-authorized cyber engagement protocols 7 minutes before GRANITE REACH received formal authority. HARM anti-radiation missiles launched from F/A-18F aircraft at 2:05 a.m. 9. HARM launches targeting active Iranian early warning and SAM guidance radars along the 3 strike corridors. 6. Achieved confirmed guidance lock and impact on active radar emitters. 3. Guided on decoy emitters, Iranian corner reflector countermeasures. A second HARM salvo of 4 missiles was tasked within 7 minutes, using updated Growler geolocation data. All 4 of the second salvo guided accurately. The JASSM-ER first wave reached Iranian territory at 2:09 a.m. The Corridor Alpha launch infrastructure in Kermanshah province, the Zagros mountain positions from which the Shahab-3 and Emad batteries had fired, began receiving precision engagement. Mobile launchers had displaced from their firing positions per IRGC post-launch doctrine. The survey equipment, preparation infrastructure, command shelters, and fuel storage had not displaced. Could not. 18 aim points across the Corridor Alpha infrastructure complex received JSS-ER engagement between 2:09 and 2:24 a.m. Seismographs at Kermanshah University registered repeated low-magnitude events throughout the window. Corridor Bravo coastal infrastructure in Bushehr and Fars provinces received JAS-SMER engagement at 2:14 a.m. Fateh 313 launch positions, Hoveyzeh staging areas, coastal radar installations, and fuel infrastructure across 26 aim points. The IRGC fast patrol vessel groups were tracked throughout by E-2D Advanced Hawkeye aircraft. 3 of the 4 groups were engaged by Harpoon anti-ship missiles from carrier air-wing aircraft between 2:07 and 2:19 a.m. All 3 rendered non-operational. The 4th had displaced to Iranian territorial waters before engagement geometry was confirmed and was tracked, but not engaged. The GBU-57 engagement of the Kavir Planning Center in the Al-Borz range occurred at 2:31 a.m. The B-2 Spirit had been holding at 51,000 feet for 19 minutes, waiting for Growler coverage to extend to the northern Iranian air defense zones. Coverage was confirmed at 2:28 a.m. The aircraft descended to weapons release altitude. The first GBU-57 released at 2:31 a.m. and penetrated 55 meters before detonating. The second GBU-57 released 12 seconds later, targeting the same facility to ensure structural completion of any reinforced secondary chambers. Tehran seismographs registered a 2.7 magnitude event. The facility that had housed the Kavir planning team, the planners of the 3-corridor operation, many of whom had been at their stations monitoring the progress of their operation, ceased to function as a command facility at 2:31 a.m. At 2:34 a.m., the adversary attempted its reserve contingency. The IRGC had positioned a battery of 16 Zulfiqar ballistic missiles in the Loristan Highlands, designated as a second-wave reserve to be activated if Kavir either succeeded beyond expectations or failed comprehensively. At 2:34 a.m., the reserve battery commander had received no communications from the Kavir Operations Center for 3 minutes, and Corridor Alpha Sector Command had degraded to intermittent voice radio. He interpreted the silence as requiring reserve activation and ordered Zulfiqar launch preparation. Time required: 22 minutes for a full salvo. An RQ-170 Sentinel operating at 62,000 feet over western Iran had been monitoring the Loristan Highlands since 11 p.m. the previous night, part of the elevated reconnaissance posture that had been in place since the intelligence assessment flagged elevated IR-GC launch preparation activity. The RQ-170 sensor feed showing the Zulfiqar battery activation reached the CAOC at Al Udeid's alternate node at 2:35 a.m. The targeting coordinator flagged it as an immediate priority engagement at 2:36 a.m. 6J ASSMER missiles from a B-1B that had completed its primary Corridor Alpha strike package were retasked via data link. 4 successfully received updated coordinates before their retasking windows closed. 2 continued to their original aim points. The 4 retasked JASMARs reached the Loristan battery at 2:51 a.m. The Zulfiqar missiles were at 17 minutes into their 22-minute preparation sequence, 5 minutes from first launch readiness. They did not reach it. 2 additional JASSMERs arrived at 2:54 a.m. as secondary confirmation. The battery infrastructure was assessed as non-functional at 2:55 a.m. based on RQ-170 imagery. By 3:04 a.m., 198 of 224 Granite Reach aim points had been confirmed engaged. 26 remained in the deepest Zagros and Alborz tunnel complexes, engineering depth exceeding the penetration capability of all available ordnance except the GBU-57, now expended on primary targets. These facilities were documented as partially functional, tunnel access points sealed, surface infrastructure neutralized, command connectivity severed, but deepest chambers potentially intact. The surviving chambers would be addressed through sustained isolation rather than direct engagement. At 3:04 a.m., the running total reached $1.87 billion. The damage assessment was calculating Iranian military losses between $9.4 and $12.1 billion in replacement value. Exchange ratio, approximately 1 to 5.8. The adversary had expended an estimated $1.1 billion, their most expensive single military operation since the Iran-Iraq War, to achieve 13 impact events, 3 minor injuries, and 0 degradation of U.S. operational capability at any defended target. At 3:11 a.m., the Iranian Integrated Air Defense Network's command structure reached degradation that prevented coordinated communication across 40% of its coverage area. Not simultaneous collapse, progressive incoherence, sector commands unable to reach adjacent sectors, battery commanders unable to receive guidance. The National Coordination Center, the Kavir planning facility, had not been functional since 2:31 a.m. The command structure had been directing the defense of a country whose offensive operation had already been comprehensively addressed. From a facility that no longer existed, the adversary did not declare defeat. There was no cessation broadcast. The network simply became unable to function as a coherent system. Individual nodes transmitting, none receiving coordinated guidance. The aggregate effect of hundreds of individual communications producing no actionable command output. The last logged coordinated transmission from an IRGC Aerospace Force Regional Command was at 3:19 a.m. After that, the signals record showed individual station transmissions, isolated, uncoordinated, increasingly without response. Final Granite Reach weapon impact logged at 3:06 a.m., 93 minutes after the first IRGC Zagros launches. Time from first adversary launch to first U.S. intercept, 3 minutes. Time from detection to counter-operation authorization, 24 minutes. Time from first launch to final U.S. weapon impact, 93 minutes. Adversary weapons launched, 312. Intercepted, 299, 95.8%. Achieving effect, 13, 4.2%. 5 base perimeter impacts at Al Udeid and Al Dhafra, 1 carrier fragment strike, 3 cruise missile near perimeter impacts, 4 debris impacts from partial intercepts. U.S. installations rendered non-operational, 0. Primary runways continuously operational. Carrier strike group operational status. Full combat tempo throughout. Granite Reach aim points engaged. 224. Confirmed neutralized. 198 of 224. 88.4%. Tunnel facilities sealed but potentially partially intact. 26. Iranian ballistic missile launch sites below operational threshold. 51 of 58 catalogued across all 3 corridors. 87.9%. Corridor infrastructure neutralized. Corridor Alpha 91%. Corridor Bravo 89%. Corridor Charlie coastal infrastructure 86%. IRGC naval vessel groups engaged. 3 of 4. Integrated air defense network. Below coordinated function threshold. U.S. munitions expended. $1.87 billion. Iranian military infrastructure replacement value assessed lost. 9.4 to $12.1 billion. Exchange ratio 1 to 5.8. U.S. personnel injured 3, all minor. U.S. aircraft lost 0. U.S. vessels lost 0. The Shamal storm had been the foundation of Operation Kavir's planning logic. It degraded optical sensors. It reduced surface visibility to 400 meters. It created the coverage gap 18 months of IRGC planning had been designed around. The storm had done everything they had modeled. What it had not done, what no weather system can do, was block the infrared signature of 176 rocket motors igniting in a 44-second window. 18 months of planning had been built on the assumption that the gap could be exploited. 14 seconds of detection demonstrated that it could not. 93 minutes. 312 weapons. 3 corridors. The most geometrically complete Iranian strike package ever assembled. The arithmetic of its failure was not complicated. The system had been designed to see through storms. The storm was not the variable that mattered. The variable that mattered was the system.